The Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our AI in Action series, where leading minds in AI from across the world share their story, success, and advice. AI in Action cuts through the hype and explores the true impact of artificial intelligence in our world today.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Howard Ting. Howard is the CEO at CyberHaven. Howard, welcome to the show.
JP, it's great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
We're delighted to have you. Howard, let's start with yourself, please. We want to learn a bit about your background and your journey in technology before CyberHaven. So can you give us a bit of an overview from where you got started and some of the roles you've held along the way and what's led you to where you are today?
I started my career in technology in 2000, really like at the peak of the last tech bubble. I think it was April of 2000 when I got into my first tech company. It was a company named RSA Security, one of the real pioneers of the cybersecurity market. And I spent basically the next 23 years now up to this point working mostly in cybersecurity, but also in the last decade in a few data infrastructure companies as well, like Nutanix and Redis. But some of the cybersecurity companies I've been part of are Palo Alto Networks and RSA. As I mentioned, I also did some work at Microsoft early in my career. So I've been a part of some pretty amazing companies and journeys. And I spent probably the first decade of my career working in product roles. And then the more recent decade working in go-to-market leadership roles, primarily like the CMO or one of the marketing leaders of those companies I mentioned. And then this company, CyberHaven, is my first CEO job. So I joined CyberHaven as CEO about 2 years ago.
So Howard, you're now, as you mentioned, CEO at CyberHaven, which we definitely want to learn about. So tell us, first of all, who are CyberHaven? What's the mission of the business? And then what drew you to this role when you were looking at next options for you?
I'm really drawn to a couple things. One is just going after big market opportunities and solving hard problems. And then secondly, drawn to people, frankly, certain types of people, what motivates them, how mission driven they are versus how capitalistic they are. I found a lot of the boxes checked at CyberHaven. So essentially what we're building, we call it a data detection and response platform. DDR is the acronym. It's a fairly new category. We were actually the first company to coin that term and start using it. And now we've seen some other companies start coming to market with that positioning. And essentially the idea is to really change how we do data protection inside organizations. And the specific problem that we're focused on is protecting intellectual property and sensitive data, customer data, et cetera, all the real crown jewels of a business today from theft and misuse. And it's a very difficult problem. So I was really drawn to CyberHaven because this is a problem that's been around for decades. And having been around cyber for a long time, I could see that there was a first generation of companies that came along and tried to solve this problem like in the middle 2000s. And many of those companies got acquired. That category canonically has been called DLP, data loss prevention. And frankly, we have the saying inside CyberHaven, DLP is a 4-letter word, like an ugly 4-letter word, because those products never worked that well and the category is really broken. So I was really drawn to a fresh, innovative approach on this problem because everything that has been done in this category since then has been more or less the same. And essentially it's ineffective, it's a 4-letter word. And so I was really drawn to solving a hard problem, really tackling it with a modern approach and a modern tech stack. And then I was really drawn to the founders. The company was founded by 4 PhDs out of a research university in Switzerland named EPFL, one of the top research universities around the world. And these guys are extremely mission driven, extremely hungry and eager to learn, really low ego, and just so focused on the problem. And not worried about making money or scaling a company or raising tons of funding, just really wanting to solve this problem in the most meaningful and effective way. And so I just loved how mission driven they were. And I loved the fact that our values really lined up well. So those are the two things that really clicked in for me. And as I mentioned, this is my first CEO opportunity. I have looked at a lot of other CEO jobs. I've been fortunate to have some pretty good career growth in my life. And so I was presented other CEO opportunities, but this one was the one that first really drew me in because I could see I could have a massive impact on this company, but this company being successful could have a massive impact on the overall cybersecurity.
And while the company operates in the cybersecurity space, you touched on one of the reasons in joining CyberHaven was using a modern tech stack, which is where I'm hoping we can talk about next. Is behind the scenes, CyberHaven is innovating in trying to tackle this problem of DLP, and AI is playing a role. So can you give us some insight into what's new and innovative about CyberHaven's approach, without giving away the secret sauce, of course, but where do you guys utilize AI and where do you see it evolving over the course of time?
I'll answer the question, but let me start by just comparing and contrasting the approach that we've taken with traditional DLP vendors. So traditional DLP vendors have a very deterministic set of policies. It says, okay, these very specific things I'm going to look for, like social security numbers or credit card numbers or other PII or PHI data. And I'm going to block them, prevent them from leaving these kind of places through these kinds of channels. Like I won't let that data go to personal instant messaging or these websites or whatever. So that approach, which is what this market has been based on for the past 15, 20 years, it works reasonably well for a very narrow data set, which is really all of that highly predictable data that has a pattern to it, which I gave you some examples. However, when you zoom out and look at today's data sets that companies need to produce and protect, the crown jewels of most companies, like source code, machine learning models, product designs, plant schematics, drilling maps, clinical research data, like all of this data that really makes a company go in its industry, there's nothing predictable about that. There's no way to write a regular expression rule to say, okay, look for this kind of source code or look for this kind of product design or these tags in the product design, because the business is innovating and changing all the time. So the security team could never keep up. So rather than looking for a very narrow set of data in a very narrow set of uses, what we do is we look at all of the data that people are creating, sharing, interacting with, and we then graph all of those events together, and then we apply kind of like a big data analytics approach to this problem. And so instead of making it so deterministic, we make it much more inferred, and we look at, instead of just like stopping the data from going out, we look at all different forms of data risk, because data doesn't have to leave your organization to present risk. One of the biggest stories from this past weekend was we learned that Chinese engineers in TikTok have access to US user data. And it was apparently some recordings of internal meetings. It must have been Zoom meetings or something, where there were some recordings, and it was exposed to certain users inside that company. And that company, those users then somehow were able to share these recordings outside the company. See, even before the users shared the recording outside the company with the press, there was risk there, because probably these people that had access to this recording maybe shouldn't have had access, and they shouldn't have been able to take that data and be able to do something with it. So what we're looking at is a much broader spectrum of data, and we're looking at a much broader spectrum of risk. And so that's why we coined our category DDR, data detection and response. So that's the kind of foundation for understanding how we're going to use AI. Now, because CyberHaven understands the ways that data moves inside an organization and how users interact with data, we have this massive data set that we can then apply machine learning and AI to be able to do things like, for example, predict risk before the risk has even occurred. For example, let's say that you have a user that doesn't belong to the engineering or R&D team, right? And this user has downloaded or accessed a bunch of engineering documents related to some future product release. And this user has hoarded a lot of this data to his or her machine. Now, this data has not leaked out or has been stolen, or nothing bad has happened yet, but there's latent risk there. And what we can do is we can train our system to look for these kinds of risks before they even occur, before the damage is even done. We can also train the system to look for interesting data to track, because if I see that the CFO has been working on some pre-release earnings data with a set of people, and I can classify that pre-release earnings document as our next quarterly earnings document. But I also see that the CFO is collaborating with the same people on a different document or a spreadsheet or something, and we haven't understood or classified that. We might say, hey, this spreadsheet actually goes with the earnings announcement. And together, they're both sensitive and they both belong to the same data set. So instead of being deterministic where someone has to tell us and admin has to tell us like, oh, these two files are part of pre-release earnings package, we can infer that spreadsheet actually goes with that earnings announcement, and we can also classify it accordingly. And so that's a way to use AI ML to automate the program of data protection within an organization, which is a big part of the challenge. It's not just the tool set, but it's also the people and processes and methodologies behind it. And we think AI ML could make a big difference in that if you're tracking the movement and the action on the data the way that we are.
You are listening to the Alldus podcast. When you're looking to scale your team, or if you are interested in showcasing your company in a future episode, reach out today. Or if you're in the market for a new role, visit our website to view open positions, www.alldus.com.
I want to now switch our attention to the team, particularly on the technology side, because a lot of people are fascinated by the world of cybersecurity, and it's quite black box in many respects from the outside looking in. I'd love to understand and have you talk to us a bit about the day-to-day on the technology team, whether it's a project life cycle or collaboration from data science, machine learning, engineering. Can you give us some insight into what it's like behind the scenes so people could visualize a day in the life or a week's work?
We're still a relatively young company that's growing very fast. So the team is small. We talk about two pizza teams, and I don't think we're too far beyond two pizza teams right now, but we are growing very rapidly. So right now, I think we have 3 teams that are working in parallel on releases, and we're releasing fairly frequently. We're not at fully continuous releases. We're releasing probably once a month right now, roughly. So we have releases on this cadence, and we're working on a different set of problems according to the roadmap that's set by the product team. Now, most of what we're doing today is a combination of addressing what customers are asking of us, but also just innovation from both inside and outside the company that we want to go tackle. So we are serving a bunch of customers, but at the same time, we're trying to solve and anticipate these new problems that are emerging. And so essentially, the way I would think about a day in the life, it's a combination for AI ML engineer. It's going to be a combination of really understanding the customer experience of CyberHaven. What is it that we have access to? What kind of data we have access to? And what we can do with that data through training it and developing models around it. And I gave you a few examples earlier of the kind of problems that we're trying to solve with AI ML. But there's going to be a lot more that we're going to be able to do, because essentially what CyberHaven is, JP, is we're like a flight recorder for data, meaning we track every single piece of data as it moves throughout the company. So we have this awesome data set. Some people have called it a GPS tracker for data, a flight recorder, whatever analogy you want to use. But basically, we have this awesome data set that's not available anywhere else. Now imagine if you could put a very powerful search engine on top of that, and then all the scenarios and all the things that you can enable. So right now, I would say any AI ML engineer that would be joining CyberHaven, they would have the opportunity to go over, ideate, and tackle these really difficult problems with this brand new data set that's never been available anywhere else. And that's really what's exciting about joining the product team at CyberHaven right now.
You mentioned there that you guys are still small, but there's a lot of growth happening in this industry as a whole, but in particular with you guys, and you're having some great success with the adoption of the platform. Can you give us some insight into what the roadmap looks like for the next 18 months to 2 years? What are some things that you're working towards? And from an overall headcount perspective, where do you see the company in 2 years from now?
Yeah, I think right now we're just over 60 people, and I could see our headcount in the next 2 years get to several hundred people. With the current macroeconomic conditions, we're constantly reevaluating how we can be more lean and more efficient, which is really back to kind of true startup days, which I like, because in the last probably 5 years, there's been a lot of excess. And I think you know that, and you've seen that in your audience has certainly seen that everywhere. So I think we're going to be lean and efficient, but we're still going to be growing massively. In terms of our revenue, our top line, I think in these next 24 months, we're going to grow our top line probably between 10 to 15x. And that's not on a small base. That's not on like some like 50, 100K of ARR. We're at many millions already. And we think we can grow that 10 to 15x in the next 2 years, because the market is massive. Every company is struggling with data protection. I gave the example of TikTok. Facebook last year, Francis Hogan, that's a failure in data protection. The Supreme Court of the United States having their Roe v. Wade judgment leaked out like that, that's a failure. And data security, data protection is a pervasive problem that everyone has. And so we know the market is massive. And I think if I just zoom out further, JP, and think even longer term beyond 2 years, like if you look at the cyber companies today that dominate the market, they're big companies like CrowdStrike that protects our devices, Palo Alto Networks, where I'm alumni from, they protect our networks. And when you think about it, like, why do we protect these things that we rent? We rent our devices, we rent our apps, we rent our infrastructure, we own our data. But where is the focus on protecting our data, securing our data? There hasn't been enough focus. And I think in the next 10 years, I think we're going to have a massive shift in the cyber market from protecting these other asset classes that kind of indirectly matter to the one that really matters, which is our data. Because ultimately, that's the only thing that a corporation owns in the long run. And we think that we're part of that movement. We're going to get people to be much more data centric in their security. I talked about 10, 15x in the next 2 years, but I think in the next 10 years, it could be many multiples of that, orders of magnitude more.
Final question from me then, Howard. You've spent a lot of time in the cybersecurity space. You've seen many different approaches to this, and you speak quite passionately about the work at CyberHaven. So I want to direct it now towards people who are working within AI in cybersecurity, who are potentially your future employees. As the CEO, you play a pivotal role in growing the business. If you were speaking to data scientists, machine learning engineers, data engineers who are working in the cybersecurity space, what is it that you could tell them about why come work at CyberHaven over some of the other great opportunities that are out there?
Yeah, I would say obviously the opportunity to reinvent such a big part of our digital infrastructure, our economy, et cetera, like that's got to be the number one reason. The picture I painted about we're going to go from network device-centric security to data-centric security, that will be the main reason. I think a lot of your audience will be interested. But the thing that I always try to convey to prospective employees and anyone that's following our company is that building a company is really difficult. It could be really stressful. It could be very tough. And sometimes the companies that are amazing from the outside aren't amazing on the inside. And I've been part of some of those companies myself. So I'm speaking from experience here, JP. My commitment to any employer, prospective employer candidate out there is that this company will aspire to be as amazing inside as it is outside. And what I mean by that is the way we treat people, the culture, the things that we pay attention to, the things that we care about. And just to put my money where my mouth is, if you look at the announcement I made when I joined CyberHaven as CEO 2 years ago, I pledged half my equity in CyberHaven to help underrepresented founders get their start. And that's my way of giving back. That's my way of proving that I care as much about helping the community and helping our team and helping other people as I do about creating wealth for the company and as shareholders and myself and my family. I'm really mission driven, JP. And I think that will come through in how the employees of CyberHaven will experience this journey. And that's probably the most important thing I can point to aside from the market opportunity.
Howard, thank you so much for your time today. It's really great to learn about your background and get a deep dive into CyberHaven and the industry as a whole. It sounds like you guys are really a driving force in shaping change in the industry, and you've given us some insight into what the future of the space looks like. You're clearly passionate about making it a great place to work, and with the growth in store for the industry and CyberHaven, it sounds like there's going to be a great opportunity to do that. So we wish you, the team, and everyone at CyberHaven the best of luck in the months and years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, JP. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.